three-part series on resiliency. For you folks who were there in December, we spoke with Wells Fargo Bank, and they're a partner in this program along with Valvoline. And today we have Craig Moughler, the Chief Supply Chain Officer with Valvoline out of Lexington, Kentucky. I've known Craig for a number of years. He knows this area very well. I believe you'll find his presentation today very, very interesting and timely. Just a reminder, the program is a three-part series with another follow-up program on the 21st in January. It'll be a roundtable with Craig and the speakers from Wells Fargo. We ask you to send as many questions you like today via the chat feature. We'll make sure those are addressed. At that point in time, I want to thank again our sponsors, Wells Fargo, and of course, Valvoline, to make this program possible. And Craig, yours, sir.
Great. Thanks, Ed. It's terrific to be with you all this morning. I'm very happy to be here. It's unfortunate that it's a virtual session. I was saying earlier, I'd much rather be there with you. As Ed said, I'm in Lexington, Kentucky. It was about 28 degrees this morning when I got up, and I think you guys have a little bit better situation down there. But nevertheless, that's the circumstance that we're in. It's good to be with you regardless. So a little bit of background on Valvoline for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Valvoline is a 150-plus-year-old company providing automotive products and services. We're in over 140 countries, but the U.S. is by far our largest and most important market. The concepts I'm going to talk about today are applicable to global supply chains, but a lot of the examples that I'm going to give are really more about our U.S. business because it's our most well-developed. So for quite a few decades, we were part of Ashland Incorporated, what's now known as Ashland Incorporated, which was initially a regional refiner, marketer of petroleum products up in the upper Midwest. Ashland underwent a transformation in the late 90s and early 2000s toward becoming a specialty chemical supplier. And Valvoline was spun off in 2017 as really the final step of that transformation. This spinoff itself affected our resilience for the most part because we've always been a pretty good, pretty strong, profitable, high cash flow type of business. And under the Ashland years, most of our cash flow, frankly, went to buying chemical companies. And so there was a very strong cash outflow from Valvoline toward the parent company. Now, obviously, as a public company ourselves, we have that cash flow of our own, which really helps our resilience tremendously. So personally, I've been with Valvoline for about 32 years, most of it either in the supply chain or I spent 17 years running as president of our international business. But in both of those circumstances, I'm pretty used to dealing with unusual circumstances and even crises. Today, I'm Chief Supply Chain Officer, accountable for the end-to-end supply chain globally. So COVID has presented a challenge to us, particularly in the U.S., as it has with many, many companies. To help deal with COVID, several of us, but I've along with several others, have taken part in a lot of webinars and so forth like this one, just to learn what other people are doing and keep an ear to the ground of good ideas. In a lot of those cases, the idea of business resilience comes up, and there's a significant interest across the board in how to build resilience into a business, what decisions are important and so forth. And, Valvoline's always been very interested in resilience. We've never talked about it much. We demonstrate it quite a bit to a lot of our customers. We have a lot of large OEM customers, a lot of very large retail customers like Walmart. And for customers like that, of course, the ability to operate and successfully through crisis or through upsets is pretty important. So we've always spent a lot of time on it. And I'll get into a second here why that is. But during this COVID time, and of course, COVID is much different than any crisis we've had before, but our performance has been pretty solid, in large part due to decisions we made over the years, deliberate decisions we made over the years. And today, I'll talk about what some of those decisions are. Now, I will say, every business is different, and some of these ideas, actually many of these ideas may not apply to your particular circumstances. They're effective in our circumstances. We're a global player with a global supply chain. Um, so, what we've done to help our resilience has been based on those circumstances. And while we've done a lot of work to become more resilient, we're not perfect. So every new crisis brings new challenges, and COVID has definitely been one of those. There's a lot of, the existing challenges from other crises happened, but this brings its own challenges on top of those. And that shows that we really have to keep learning, evolving, and improving. And so while I hope to give each of you something to think about today, I also hope that you challenge my thinking and my assumptions on the subject so that we can become a lot more resilient as well. Okay, let me see. Are you seeing that switch? No. Okay, there we go. Ed, did it switched? Okay, good. Okay, so when you hear the word 100-year event, a lot of people think of things that happen only very rarely. There's been a lot of books written like The Black Swan about how to recognize and react to extremely rare events. And these books, unfortunately, kind of reinforce the idea that the events, while they're possible, are once in a lifetime types of things. This leads people in many cases to regard events like this as something that we can think about someday, or we need to think about someday, or worse yet, maybe we could ignore them altogether. However, that's not really the reality of it. Even the actual theory of 100-year events, if you get into the mathematics of it, would contradict that idea. The 100-year concept applies to a specific event that's expected to happen at a particular place once in 100 years. But, for a sizable global company, and considering all the different things that can happen and all the various places they can happen, then I think, events happen a lot more often than 100 years. So this slide illustrates a few of the things that we've dealt with over the years. So we have two large production sites in the upper Midwest, and we supply those sites with raw materials from the Gulf Coast by barge up the Mississippi and Ohio River. This gets to a little bit about how we started thinking about resilience as an issue. So as I'm sure some of you know, these rivers are subject to both spring floods and summer droughts, and both of those can severely disrupt the barge traffic on the river. So we noticed many, many years ago that the Corps of Engineers kept quoting 100-year events, but it seemed like every year or 2 years there'd be a 100-year event, and it's like, well, how can that be? And that's when we basically kind of came to the conclusion, well, it's a 100-year event at St. Louis, or it's a 100-year event at Cincinnati, but 100-year events on the river as a whole happen a lot more often than every 100 years. So this led us to realize that we really need to be ready to handle these events at any time. And so we developed, this was a start of our, if you want to call it that, the start of our resilience training or business continuity planning. So over time, we developed backup supply lines, backup rail lines, new ways of handling orders. So typically, one of our customer orders will be focused, or will be sent only to a given plant. So there's a 1-to-1 correlation between plant and customer location. But when one of those plants goes down, of course, then we have to change that and ship from a different plant. Enhanced supply chain planning processes. And these events seldom, if ever anymore, cause disruption at the customer level. Now, they may cost us money because rail transport's more expensive than barge, for example, but they very seldom, if ever, cause disruption at the customer level. So this was the beginning of our thought. Of course, other types of events have also come into play in the last few years. The second photo represents Hurricane Harvey, and I know hurricanes are going to be very close to your thought process as well because of Katrina and also this year. Hurricane Harvey shut our Houston plant, which is our second largest plant, for several days in 2017, disrupted raw material supplies to really all of our plants because several of our raw material suppliers are in that area as well. And of course, caused havoc with the national freight system for quite a few weeks. Many of you will remember this event. Some probably lived through it, probably dealt with your own issues because of it. But during this event, we broke out our crisis protocols. In some cases, we had to enhance them or change them because it was a different type of event. But again, there was very little, if any, customer disruption due to this really serious weather event, other than in some cases, the disruption caused by a customer themselves being impacted. So for example, several of our retail customers had distribution centers in Houston, and in that case, they were disrupted because of their impact, not because of ours. So the third photo was kind of our third step. Some of you will remember in March of 2019, a massive fire broke out in the ITC terminal in Deer Park, Texas, outside Houston. As it happens, our Houston plant, which I mentioned just a second ago, is literally surrounded by this terminal. The tanks that burned up are across the street from our plant. So that plant was completely out of commission for more than 5 weeks. We couldn't even get people into, it took a lot of effort to even get a person or two in to look at the plant to see what kind of condition it was in, because they needed to have that area cleared while the fire was extinguished, investigated, and the damage repaired. So thankfully, our plant wasn't directly damaged, although we were using several of the tanks that were damaged, so we had to account for that. But unlike Hurricane Harvey, which affected all of the significant lube industry capacity in the region, so Harvey wasn't as much of a competitive threat because we were all in the same boat. In this case, this crisis affected really only Valvoline, which of course made our response really important from a competitive standpoint. So during this time, we again implemented a business continuity plan, added to it because again, the conditions were different, improved it based on specific learnings from this exact event. And again, customer orders were not impacted to any significant degree in this event. We know that some of our competitors didn't fare as well in either of these events, as we actually gained new business due entirely to our ability to supply. So after the ITC fire, we thought we'd seen everything and we were ready for anything. Then, of course, as we all know, COVID 2020 pandemic began earlier this year, and it affected all aspects of most businesses. We again implemented the plan, added to it a large number of new responses to, for example, keep our members safe in the facilities, distancing and masks and temperature taking and things like that within the plants. And thus far, again, while the crisis is still not past us, we've not experienced any significant customer impact, at least due to our impact. Now, this pandemic has affected us and probably most everybody else in many ways. For example, the overall economic impact is pretty large. The UN projects that global GDP is going to decline almost 1% this year versus a projected 3% growth before COVID. One of our main raw materials is crude oil, of course, or is crude oil derived. And crude oil use is expected to be down 8% year over year. S&P estimates that the global auto industry is going to be down about 20% this year, and then maritime transport down about 4%. So pretty dramatic reduction in overall economic activity that we've had to deal with, as well as everybody else. Now, thankfully, we've been listed as an essential business. So the impact on us is muted a little bit because of that. The global consulting company McKinsey recently published a research paper on the subject of supply chain resilience, and a pretty interesting paper. They estimated that across all global industries, a typical company should expect to experience a significant disruption event about every 3.7 years. Quite a bit different than the 100-year event idea, right? They also calculated that a typical global company should expect to lose 42% of a single year's profitability every decade due to these types of events. That's a big number for most companies. And now note that these numbers are averages, and that many companies will do much better and many will do much worse. So clearly it's an important issue financially, and that those companies that are prepared and perform better than the averages are going to be in a much better position than those who are not prepared and perform worse. So to summarize this part of the message, the first and very important step in building resilience is to recognize that it's necessary. It's something that's going to differentiate you from your competitors. It may very well, in many cases, be something that keeps you in business as time goes on. And I'd also note that there's no such thing as a perfect plan. it's something that you just have to continue to work on because every event is different than the events before it. Okay, let's. So how do you define resilience then? The textbook definition, or one textbook definition, is the one shown here: the ability to recover quickly from difficulties, or some people would call it toughness. It's important to note that it's also similar to agility, which is also seen generally as a positive thing for a business to have. So the way I would think about it is that resilience has to do with response to a negative change. Agility is sometimes defined as a company's ability to respond to or even cause a positive change. While there are subtle differences, in many cases, improving resilience also improves agility. So the important thing here is there's a benefit to most companies, even if a natural disaster doesn't happen, because it makes you more agile, more able to take advantage of market conditions. So how do you build resilience into your business? There are a lot of levers to pull. And as we'll discuss several times, there are trade-offs to be made with many of the decisions. In other words, a balance to be struck. The good news is that it's possible to make progress with some fairly simple decisions. So let's start with the longer term, more fundamental strategic decisions. The first is business structure. Business structure has to do with what portions of the value chain you take part in. In other words, and that in turn determines how much operating leverage you have. In other words, given a certain amount of additional volume or loss of volume, how much profitability do you lose? Usually operating leverage is seen as a good thing by Wall Street and others, but many times operating leverage requires high fixed costs, which can increase risk and lower flexibility when volumes are very volatile like they are today. So things to look at there would be what percentage of your cost of goods sold is really variable versus fixed. How much do you use toll manufacturing? How much do you outsource? How much do you use 3PLs on the distribution side? Do you make all your products or buy certain ones or buy all of them? All of those affect the operating leverage that you have. Now, again, even within this one item, there's going to be trade-offs because higher operating leverage decreases resilience, but at the same time, using toll manufacturing and so forth makes your information flow a lot more fragmented, which is a negative. So, but these are just the things to look at. Financial structure is also really important. So cash is king in times of crisis. In general, less financial leverage, that is to say debt on your balance sheet, can lead to or will lead to flexibility and then better resilience because of that. Exception to that, of course, might be lines of credit, which many companies used in the early days of the COVID pandemic, including Valvoline, to improve liquidity. So we had a fairly sizable line of credit, which we drew down almost immediately and put on the cash on the balance sheet. Strong balance sheet is really your best protection from a financial standpoint. In many cases, it just comes down to do you have enough cash and cash flow to outlast the problem. The channel structure, in other words, how do you sell your product or service, also makes a difference. So do you sell direct to final customers or final consumers, or do you use distributors? We're really fortunate in the sense that we are a product company generally, but we're also the biggest, largest quick lube operator in the country. So we have well over 500 company-owned Valvoline Instant Oil Change quick lubes. And then we have, I think, another 1,400 franchise stores. And these stores are basically cash driven. So they're effectively serving consumers themselves, people who drive cars, and they're collecting cash or credit cards, with the same as cash. And so from a cash flow standpoint, they're extremely important. Now, the flip side of that is they also have expensive stores. And so they cause our fixed cost to be higher as well. Do you use distributors? Valvoline in the U.S. uses some distributors in some areas, but we also operate as our own distributor in certain areas in some cities, about 9 different cities around the country. Again, distributors can help because they lower your operating leverage, but again, it leads to, if you're not integrated with them from a data standpoint, it can lead to fragmented data flow, which is not a good thing in times of crisis. If you use a lot of joint ventures, sometimes joint ventures, we use joint ventures extensively outside the U.S., and some of them have terrific cash flow, but it's not that simple to get the cash flow into your own company coffers always. So that can be an issue as well. The level of digital integration is important. Again, how well information flows, not only within your organization, but to the upper part of the organization, or to your suppliers, and also down from your customers, is extremely important. Fast and correct decision making is really paramount in times of crisis. And so having terrific information flow is really important. We'll talk about that more later. Culture is really important. We'll talk about that more, but basically the team-oriented cultures help a lot because they allow you to make changes to the organization faster. And then the supply chain will spend really most of the rest of the time talking to supply chain. Now, note that most of these things are typically thought through by the leaders of a business, the top level of the business, but not always with resilience in mind. And it's clear as I listen to other companies in some of these calls that they didn't really consider resilience when they designed how their supply chain is going to work. And now in some cases, they're paying the price for it. Note also that many of these decisions are not easy to change once a crisis begins. So if resilience is not considered up front and the decision leads to poor resilience, then you're going to be left with that probably. So, for example, most banks won't give you a line of credit after a crisis begins. If you have a line of credit before it begins, then you can draw that down. Adding major IT projects to improve information flow is going to be pretty difficult because of the cost as well as the time frame associated with and so forth. So note also that, again, many of them are going to involve trade-offs. Again, the distributor is a good example because using distributors can involve less control of the ultimate customer experience and less control of integrating data across the company and so forth. So it's just important to consider it up front, but with these items, in many cases, there's really not a perfect answer. Okay, so let's get into the supply chain design. We're gonna take this really from the longer term items to the shorter term items, and the longest term items in the supply chain is really how the supply chain is put together. This is one of the largest impacts you can make to how resilient your company is, because resilience really comes down to the ability to generate cash or reserve cash or maintain cash in challenging conditions. And the supply chain design has a large impact on cash flow. So some things to watch: vertical integration, or to the degree to which a company makes its products or makes its raw materials even, versus buying raw materials or buying products already made. I already talked about that a little bit because it impacts operating leverage and data flow. But it impacts operating leverage and data flow in opposite directions. So again, there's going to be a balance to strike there. Purchasing strategies can make a big difference. Obviously, purchasing departments or purchasing functions typically are going to want to consolidate a supply base to build the volume up and build leverage against suppliers. I think in most companies that's probably true. However, if you think about it, if you have only one supplier, and particularly if that one supplier only has one supply point, it leaves you very, very open to a variety of different crises. So it's something to think about. Valvoline, in many cases, has tried, as part of our business continuity planning, has tried to have our cake and eat it too here. So we'll have a primary supplier, but we'll have a backup that's approved and ready to go. And in many cases, we have to give them 10 or 20% of the business or something like that to keep them interested. That's helped a lot. So scale versus and production redundancy is one of the major trade-offs. In a perfect world, everybody wants to own your own plant and run it at 100% capacity, of course. But when a crisis hits, and particularly if the crisis hits the location of that plant, or crisis hits and volume drops significantly, the fixed cost of running a large plant can really be a problem. So we've been very deliberate about make versus buy decisions. We're equally comfortable with buying products from others, but we also make probably the majority of our own products. This allows us to be flexible when things go wrong. So if we need additional capacity, we have relationships already with toll manufacturers that we can put certain products to pretty quickly. Likewise, from a pure theoretical manufacturing standpoint, the consultants would say, one very large plant in a region might be the right answer. But again, from the standpoint of resilience and resistance to crisis, several smaller plants are going to provide redundancy. In Valvoline's case, we in the U.S. use a system of several plants, and this has allowed us to stay into business several times, even when one of the plants is out of commission for a while. I've already discussed that with the Deer Park or Houston plant. Of course, this requires a bit of excess capacity. So design operating capacities versus demand is important. Again, the consultants would say you want to run the plants 100%, and that excess capacity is bad. But from a resilience standpoint, it's a good decision not to run all production facilities 24/7 on a routine basis. So many of the manufacturers I've listened to in the calls since COVID started have complained about the difficulty of managing a supply chain that's predicated on exporting everything out of China, particularly for products that have to use ocean transport to be competitive. That long transport time soaks up cash flow, reducing flexibility and reducing resilience. Many times, after crisis arrives, fast decision making and fast cash flow are needed, and anything that adds time to either one of those is going to be damaging. Manufacturing cost versus warehousing and freight cost and logistics is also something to look at. Again, the consultants typically would focus on manufacturing costs first, because that's where the fixed costs usually are. In Valvoline's case, we're fortunate in that our manufacturing is fairly light. It's basically blending and packaging. And so those two are pretty balanced. And what that basically means is that allows us to have multiple plants without paying a very big cost for that. And then the other thing is keeping in mind in trying to keep your supply points close to demand, where the demand is. And again, this comes down to really shortening that cash cycle and turning raw materials into cash as quickly as possible. Direct versus indirect sales channels, I already talked about that a bit. That's an important item. Also on the supply chain, the physical part of it is important as well. And we've done a lot to sort of integrate our distributors into our systems now in the last 2 years, and that's helped a bunch as well. And then using internal freight versus common carriers. There's a lot of things that come into play there. We generally use common carriers, although we, again, from a resilience standpoint, we keep a small fleet so that if things happen, we have a certain amount of capacity in-house to carry loads. So basically, the idea is when you make decisions about how supply chains design, you really need to consider resilience as a really important design factor. These are some of the most difficult things to change, at least quickly. The best thing to do is to think of supply chain as an end-to-end system operating within a larger system made up of your own company, as well as suppliers, distributors, end users, even the government regulatory environment. You have to think about what the regulators are going to do if and when this or that happens. So when we make business decisions, generally we make a lot of assumptions about how the system's going to work together. And in routine times, these assumptions are typically correct, so no problem. Again, though, when crisis arrives, many of the assumptions are no longer valid. So it's important to understand them and think explicitly about them and devise emergency plans. So if I go back to the river flooding example that I talked about earlier, typically it takes 7 days to get a barge from the Gulf Coast up to Cincinnati, for example. And that's pretty consistent as long as there's not a flood or a drought. Obviously, in flood times or drought times, that can extend to 14 or 20 days. In some cases, it's even impossible to get barges that far up the river, or there have been times when it's been that far. So the contingency planning really comes down to thinking about that beforehand and saying, okay, if that happens, then this is how we're going to work around it. We're either going to ship from another plant. We're going to ship by rail, ship raw materials by rail instead of barge. During that time of the year, because the flooding typically happens in the spring, during that time of year, we may rent a tank, particularly if there's a big snow load in the Midwest. We may rent a couple tanks and increase our raw material storage in those plants before the floods hit. So that's really what it's all about. Again, these decisions are made infrequently, so it's important to consider resilience as part of it. All right. The second thing is really the cultural and process factors. One thing that Valvoline's really fortunate in is we've always had a really strong teamwork culture. Our teamwork skills are quite good. There's a downside to that. There are some downsides to that as well. But people like to work across functions. We're not very siloed as an organization. So it's not that difficult to get a group of people together to deal with the problem and evaluate the situation, evaluate the circumstances, and develop changes to react to those circumstances. It's natural for us as an organization. Listening to other companies, it seems like it's not that natural, maybe in all cases. And that can be something to think about as well. From a process standpoint, it's important to have a really strong S&OP process. If you're not a supply chain person, that stands for supply and operations planning, or sales and operations planning. Sorry. So it's basically just a process of work between the sales force and the supply chain planning group to kind of talk about what's coming up, whether it's promotional activity, so on and so forth. How much your supply chain people interact with customers. In many cases, that is that's not really thought of as a good thing in many companies. In Valvoline, it's pretty natural, and particularly with our larger customers, the retailers and so forth. We would have a supply chain planning person assigned to every retail customer we have, and that supply chain planning person is talking to the retailer supply chain folks every day. Centralized versus decentralized planning. We used to be completely decentralized. Every plant did their own production planning, their own forecasting. In the 90s, we changed and centralized almost all of that. And that's been a big help because it allows us to very quickly move orders and move demand from one place to another when we need to. And then institutional diagnostic skills like Six Sigma, the traditional, what those of us who are older would call TQM skills. Lean skills are really important in the sense that it's a set of skills that the teams can use to quickly diagnose problems. Now, the flip side of this is sometimes these skills, these companies that are really good at Six Sigma also are really good at focusing on small incremental change only. And, when you're in times of crisis, it's not continuous improvement you're after. You really have to look for large changes that are going to help you meet demand. So during COVID, for example, we established a control tower, which is basically a weekly, or in some cases twice weekly, meeting of all the supply chain planning and production people to talk about what's happening in the marketplace. A lot of leadership contact with customers. We increased that so that we're always asking customers, what's really happening right now. Because there's so much, you can read so much about what's happening, and so much of it isn't really very well founded. In fact, a lot of operating contact with customers. So we've got a history of that, but again, a lot more of that going now. Even executive team interaction on conditions, process changes, and rules of the road. So the way we do things has changed during COVID, and it changed in a very deliberate way. There's still processes. I would say it's pretty stable now. But in the early days, we were changing how we did things, the rules of the road, the expectations, and so forth. So an example of rules are product needs to go to the highest need at all times. So if we have a distributor that's put in an order and it's obvious that the order is more than they really need, we're not afraid to go to that distributor and say, look, you're going to need to wait. We know what you need because they're serving most of our customers. We also, one of the rules is prioritize customer service over cost. Cost is important, but staying in business is more important. And so we manage the cost after the fact. So it's not that cost is not important at all, but customer service, in other words, delivering orders on time is the primary goal at this point. And then communicating to partners really aggressively so that all of our partners, both our suppliers, our distributors, our retail customers, our VOC stores themselves, there's transparency and they trust that we know what we're doing. And then the pace of a lot of our normal processes has changed. So our S&OP process used to be monthly and it's now weekly. Our demand planning process in general was monthly and it's now weekly. So the way to think about it is decisions need to be made more quickly. So you need to do what it's necessary to make those decisions more quickly. So the first step in making that happen is understanding what's really happening. The second step is making sure that the rules and the processes fit the circumstances. The third is making sure that the normal processes are working fast enough that you can react to change. And then once all of that is done, it's important to shove decision-making down aggressively. And again, this is a little bit counterintuitive, and many of the calls that I've been on the companies have done the opposite of that. They've pulled decision-making up into the organization in order to make correct decisions, and that is a better way to make correct decisions. The problem is it slows the decision-making down. Make sense? Okay. All right. Another factor that's really important is how your IT systems and how you are set up and how you handle data. A crisis, particularly like COVID, can cause a lot of noise in the demand signal. By noise, what I mean is it's disconnected from what's really happening in the real world. One cause of that, of course, is what I just mentioned, that distributors may be wanting to load up a little bit on volume or on inventory because they think that they may not be able to get it down the road, or they may have opportunities because some of their competitors have fallen down. Retailers many times heavy up, or in some cases, it's the opposite. Retailers don't always know what's happening in their own stores, and so sometimes they miss forecasts. So it's really important to get data from the point of sale as much as possible. Again, we're really fortunate in the sense that we get daily data, demand data from all of our retail customers. That's Walmart, AutoZone, people like that. And then obviously our own Quick Lube business is a big customer for our supply chain. And we get daily point of sale data from them as well. So that's really helped us. Many companies don't have this capability for a variety of reasons. And I have to say, we didn't necessarily buy VOC, so we had data necessarily, but it certainly helps. It's important to plan your overall supply at the highest level possible, but then manage stock and customer orders really hands-on. In other words, make sure that you've got somebody watching orders and service levels, and you're on it as quickly as something starts to fall off. And then the one thing that's helped us a lot also is really understanding the market drivers as well. So one of the things that drives our business ultimately is how many miles are driven in the United States. And so there are ways that you can get that data. There's also free data that you can get from the government, the EIA, about how much gasoline is sold weekly. And so we've been tracking gasoline sold weekly and diesel as well on the heavy duty side. And that's given us a really good linkage actually to how many miles are being driven in the market. And so when the demand has been not terrible, it's been down 8 to 10%, but it's volatile. It's up and down and up and down. April was awful. The demand was down, or miles driven were down 40% in April, I think 45%. But by early May, it was actually up from the prior year. So that sort of whipsaw effect could have been a real problem, except that we were watching miles driven and we knew it was going to happen. We saw it coming. So thinking ahead on these things can make all the difference in the world. Making sure your IT systems really well integrated is also important. Many companies that I listen to have grown through acquisition, and that is a good idea in many ways. But what it can do is it can cause multiple IT systems in a single company. We're fortunate in the sense that we have one system basically worldwide, and so we can get data on internal data on demand and so forth. That was never really a problem. What we've really focused on lately during the COVID crisis is getting a lot better at getting the outside data. And then lastly, these are the operational decisions that you can make. And these are really shorter term decisions. So if you haven't done anything else besides these, even after the crisis starts, normally it's possible to pull some of these levers. Obviously, increasing your finished goods safety stock. Again, that's a little difficult to do the math on, because if your volume is down 15 or 20%, do you want to calculate on today's volume, or do you want to use historical volume to do safety stock calculations? Our point of view would be you're eventually going to be back at the normal levels, or hopefully maybe even a little bit better. And so you really need to make sure your safety stock is adequate to, in all cases, and that needs to be calculated at every step. So we calculate it at the plant level, we calculate it at our distribution center level, and in most cases we calculate it and give it to our distributors also. So we tell distributors what stock they need to be carrying, and that's been a big help. That's something we really only started doing in the last year. Thankfully, we started before the COVID crisis hit. Raw material safety stocks are also important for the same reasons. We talked about redundant suppliers earlier. That's really important. Material backups. Sometimes this is possible and sometimes it's not. But if one of your raw material, you have to think through if what happens if one of your raw material supplier plants goes down. Is there an alternative supplier for that particular material? Motor oils, which is our main product line, are pretty well regulated by the combination of, not by the government, but by a combination of OEMs and chemical companies and the lube companies. And so it's not that easy to just swap out raw materials. There's work involved. There's technical work involved in having alternative formulas for products. But yet we do that work because it's important to our ability to be resilient. The one thing I didn't talk about before, but it comes up as part of doing this end-to-end discussion, or this end-to-end thought process, is really understanding where your suppliers and your customers are in terms of risk. Most of our suppliers for Valvoline are large companies, or at least our main suppliers are large companies like Lubrizol and Oronite, which is a part of Chevron. Large companies with really strong balance sheets. So we haven't been quite as worried about the large ones, but we do have some critical suppliers that are smaller. And so we've done a lot of work understanding where they are from a balance sheet standpoint and so forth, where they are. In some cases, we've even gotten into making them tell us, or making them explain to us how they're keeping their employees safe. Because if their employees, if they have a COVID breakout in one of their plants, or even worse yet, their only plant, that affects us as well. It's also important to customers, because in particular, an example of this would be our franchisees, for example. Many of our franchisees are small companies and don't necessarily have the financial depth that a larger company would have. And so we developed a program almost instantly when COVID started to help them out with extended terms. I think we even suspended their royalty payments for a period of time to make sure that our franchisees were going to come out on the other side of the pandemic in a healthy way. So it's really important to think about the whole, if you want to call it an ecosystem. I think that term's a little bit overused sometimes, but that's basically what it is. You can't just think of yourself. You have to look for places where the ecosystem is going to be unhealthy, if you want to call it that, and see what you can do to help that out. Raw material order lead times. We've always put a lot of emphasis on this as part of our normal contingency planning, making sure that order lead times are as short as possible. That also helps that cash cycle. And then having a flexible workforce helps as well. to the degree that you use temporary workers, and you can scale up and scale down. I've heard of companies, or I've talked to companies who have extreme control on overtime, and I think that's a almost a cultural problem. Obviously, overtime costs money, and you want to minimize it as much as possible. But if you have to get the orders out the door, again, you have to prioritize getting the orders out the door and pay the overtime to do that. Again, these decisions are really operational decisions, and in most cases, the risk assessment with customers and so forth, it helps to do it with suppliers. It helps to do it ahead of time. But for the most part, the rest of them decisions can be made relatively quickly or changed relatively quickly. So if you find yourself in a crisis period, these are things that maybe you can start to do pretty quickly. All right. Finally, let's summarize kind of some of the core ideas. These ideas, you should see these ideas underlying everything that I've talked about. One is upfront design is important, but it's not that useful once the crisis starts. So the time to think about this, the first couple slides, the ideas on the first couple slides, is not after the crisis begins. It's before the crisis begins. Second, cash is king. Monitor cash flow constantly. Push on cash flow constantly, with a balance that you have to have enough inventory, for example, to maintain customer service. Understand what's happening as much as possible in the entire value chain, not just your own. So even to the point of understanding what your supplier's main raw materials are and where they come from is important, because in some cases your supplier may be healthy, but one of their raw material suppliers has a problem. Gather real-time data from as many sources as possible, and then synthesize that to form a picture of what's happening today. The thing that's unique, that's interesting about these things is, interesting in a bad way, is that things can change very, very fast. And those of you who are watching the COVID crisis right now are seeing the rates, the COVID infection rates ramping up pretty dramatically right now. And I don't think we've quite even seen the effect of the Thanksgiving holiday yet. So it's really important to almost stay day to day with the data. The internal data isn't quite as important, but the external data in particular. And then again, get hands-on with rules, processes, and goals. So in a sense, what I'm saying is delegate less, delegate the process issues and the rules and the goals less, make sure that you know what's going on with those. But then once those are in place, push the real day-to-day operating decisions down as much as possible to make sure that you're executing as quickly as possible. Increase the pace of the standard processes. That's all about speed and of execution. And recognize and just accept it, that many, or if not all, of your decisions are going to require trade-offs between efficiency and effectiveness. It's important to push as much as you can on that, because obviously occasionally you'll run into a supplier who will try to take advantage of the situation or whatever, and you need to make sure that doesn't happen. But there will be times when it's going to cost you more money to keep your people safe, to keep the plants operating, to keep the distribution centers operating, than what it would in normal times. And if you want to stay in business and you want to keep the cash flowing, that's a pretty good investment. So went through quite a lot in a fairly short period of time. Are there any questions?
Craig, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, if you can speak up, it'd help.
Okay, I'll speak a little louder. That's not a problem for a guy from Kentucky. A couple of questions here, and thanks to the group for sending this to us. Kind of a side question. It deals with the resiliency issue on a different scale. This is referring to the COVID-19 vaccine. What action will Valvoline take should employees refuse to take the vaccine?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have a 2-level governance on the COVID problem right now. We have a steering team which is made up of a couple of our executive level folks, myself included, and then what we call the VLT, which is our executive group, both of which are dealing with the COVID decisions pretty quickly. And again, as I mentioned before, things are changing fast. We haven't really made a final decision on how we're going to deal with the vaccine. At this point, we're starting to talk about it. Our employees are considered, or our business is considered essential. But if you look at what the government is saying about the timing of people getting vaccine, we don't think it's going to be offered to us for a couple months yet. They're going to start obviously with doctors and nurses, healthcare professionals and so forth. And so we're a couple months down the road before we need to have a decision. The things we're talking about, or we're thinking about balancing, if you want to call it that, is, obviously we'd like to have all of our employees get the vaccine because that keeps them safe, which is important to us. It also keeps us, more likely than not, keeps us in business from a plant or facility shutdown standpoint. And it would allow us to get our employees, our headquarters employees, back into the office. We've been working remotely since middle of March. And there's quite a process. Sitting in my office right now, but this is the first time I've been in my office for like 2 months, I think.
Wow.
And there's quite a process to get in here. At any rate, so the flip side is on the vaccine is there's a legal point of view that says you really don't want to tell people they have to get it, nor do we necessarily even have the right to tell people they have to get it. So there's that point of view. So I think where we're going to end up with it, I would guess, is we're going to provide it to the degree that it's not already free from the government. We're going to provide it to anybody who wants it, and we're going to strongly encourage people to get it. We may have certain types of employees that we would require, particularly where we operate as our own distributor. So we would have truck drivers delivering product to quick lubes and car dealers and people like that. So they're out in the public, they're out among people. There's really no way to do their job without being among people. And so with people like that, I think we probably will make the encouragement much stronger. Obviously, the people in our, the employees or the team members in our stores, in our VOC stores, are also among the public. Although the changes we made in our stores in terms of, we've never allowed people, or we've never encouraged people to get out of their cars. We encourage people to stay in the cars. Now we encourage them to keep their windows up, except when it comes to paying, the bill. And of course, all of our people have masks, and we have a lot of hand sanitizer and things like that. So the people in the VLC stores, we may very well encourage a little bit stronger also. Frankly, the headquarters folks, working from home has not been that big of an issue for us. It's a good question. Thank you.
This was a very good question. Got a number of questions, sir. Craig, we're going to be tight on time. Do you know of, or have you created a resiliency sports scorecard?
No, there's two ideas that I've heard from other people that I wanted, once this is over, we're going to take advantage of, or we're going to do. One is a scorecard. Obviously, most of what I talked about today, we have on one scorecard or another. So we have many scorecards. We have a plant level scorecard. We have a supply chain overall scorecard. And then the cash is king part. We naturally, as a company, we watch cash flow quite aggressively. So that part would be on a scorecard someplace. But putting it all on one scorecard, we've not done. That's one idea that I do think we want to do. The other is doing tabletop exercises. I got that question from somebody, and the answer is we don't do tabletop exercises for this particular problem. Now, we do tabletop exercises, and those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's a situation where you get a team around a table, and you introduce a scenario that nobody's heard the scenario beforehand. It's a way to practice what your plan says, basically. So you introduce a scenario, and then that team has to decide what to do. We do that for scenario planning for EH&S. So, for example, all of our plants do tabletop exercises for what would happen if a tank would have a leak or things like that. So from an environmental standpoint, we do tabletop exercises pretty aggressively, but we've never done it for this idea. So that's an idea I think we're going to follow up on and implement once this is over. It's a good question.
That was somebody referred to as also as a report card, by the same difference, I would think. But another question for you, along with resiliency, one of our guests here. What is the company doing with the cybersecurity issue with so many employees working remotely?
Yeah, that's that's a good one. Um, Number one, we require, if you're using a company computer at home, we require our IT group. We don't pay for your internet necessarily because we figure everybody needs to have internet anyway. But we do. Our IT group does have to approve your internet situation, and then if you're working on a company computer at home, you need to use a VPN, a virtual private network, um, which gives at least some level of a reasonable level of protection. Actually, the cyber problems we have are typically a different type. They don't come necessarily from working from home. Most of the people many of the people travel anyway. So that idea, the idea of using VPN and so forth, is really no different than their rule has been in place. So, for example, when I ran international, of course, I traveled quite a lot internationally and took my computer and so that rule was in place for me at that time, that you couldn't get into the network unless you were connected via VPN. Um, so I don't know that part of it has been that big of a deal yet. Um, Obviously, we have all the normal. We have a very active cyber uh, security program, uh, because it's an important thing to do, but also because if you think of the quick lube business, we have quite a lot of consumer data as well. So it's more important to us than it would be for a traditional industrial company, for example.
To do this. Um, a side question here. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that resiliency planning. Um, did you mention that banks are requiring that now, Craig, or they would start requiring these as far as a lending or loan process, a line of credit process?
Well, what I said was the bank. It was a strange time. If any of you are in the financial area, you would probably have experienced this. Um, the April timeframe was pretty strange because if you remember what happened, the government injected a lot of cash into the economy. So there was certainly a lot of cash out there. And so banks wanted to loan money, but they were very particular about, from a risk standpoint, about understanding how a company was responding or responding to COVID, and how they were what they were doing about it, what they were doing to ensure their cash flow. Now, in Valvoline's case, we had a strong balance sheet to begin with, to be honest with you. So it wasn't that critical. In retrospect, it wasn't that critical, although at the time it seemed a little more serious. And we hadn't really, I don't think our folks, our treasury folks had really factored in the VOC part. The VOC, the fact that Valvoline Install Change, it's our second largest business. It's a very large business, more than $1 billion business, and it works on cash. From a receivable standpoint, there's no receivables, is a pretty big deal. But we had a line of credit also, um, a standby line of credit. And so all we did, and we weren't alone in this, a lot of companies did that. We just drew down the line of credit and put the cash on the balance sheet.
Great. Really quickly, Michael Olivier, you've been unmuted. I was let you jump in real quickly. That mine, we got 1 minute here, 2 minutes. Your background in the state is is very intense, and you work with a number of manufacturing companies, many companies throughout the state. And if you're able to hear me, do you have any thoughts about this? But this presentation today, I would think would be very valuable to a number of businesses in the energy sector, obviously, but beyond that in Louisiana. Any input there from you? Thoughts?
Well, one thing is I really wish I would have sent this on to a group which is memorialized by the state legislature dealing with the whole issue of supply chain. And they have to file a report on an annual basis to the legislature relative to supply chain. I'd like to steal a lot of what your outline provided because we can use this as part of the report, frankly. Craig, this is very good information. And it just, you start thinking of so many items as you would address them that would come up that are not specific to supply chain, but apply to supply chain. You know, we in Louisiana are very concerned about the future for the oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
And you were mentioning how your supply, much of it comes out of Louisiana.
Yep.
In terms of going to your other facilities, mostly shipped by barge. I'm sitting in my Baton Rouge office looking at the Mississippi River right now and barges coming through and thinking about all of the issues you guys have to contend with alternatively when you have floods and or bridges out and or whatever.
Yep.
And as you were talking about this, I was thinking about the resilience is a big deal. In fact, whenever we had the floods 4 years ago, when we had our meetings with the can you close that door? When we had our meetings with the federal government representatives, that was the first thing that came out of their mouth, which was different from what after Katrina and Rita. We talked a little bit about resilience, but boy, resilience. They said if we get any assistance from the federal government, the number one criteria that's going to have to be met is resilience. In other words, if you rebuild a water system, if you rebuild whatever, you're going to have to build it for resilience.
Yep.
And as you were talking about what you all are doing in your thought process, that essentially is what you guys do. You look at that alternatively. And I just, Ed, I'm afraid we didn't have a large crowd today. But Craig, I want to get your information because I may ask you to do something for one of our others. Craig, let me ask you a question. You remember being from Louisiana, having stayed a long time in Louisiana. One of the issues that we have in our state, and we're going to talk about supply chain now, is the river pilots.
Yep.
So I know you have to contend with that in your business.
Yep.
And Louisiana, you know what the situation is here. I mean, these guys charge an excessive amount of dollars to the tune of like $750,000 is what their salary is. Now I realize they have a lot of cost associated with it, but it's a very interesting dynamic because it's a closed society.
Yep.
You got to be born into it almost.
Yep.
And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that gets down to the idea of pinch points, right? So there's a concept in kind of supply chain theory that you need to look for pinch points, and actually it's really more business theory because I talk about supply chain because that's what I do now. But in the grand scheme of things, the supply chain is kind of the underpinning. It's the foundation of most businesses, most product type businesses anyway. And that's clearly a pinch point for certain types. Now, you can try to go around them, but for certain types of transportation, it's going to be difficult to get around them, right?
Yeah, you can't.
If you're coming up that river, that's how it's going to happen.
Yeah, so that's one of the issues. We always look for the weak points in terms of what are the things that keep businesses from coming to our state. As Ed talked about, my background is economic development, having served as Secretary of Economic Development for the state of Louisiana, now serving for this business roundtable I work for. I have over 120 business leaders throughout the state. Our role is to impact public policy as it relates to business and industry from the business point of view. But this river pilots thing is something, as one example.
Yep.
Of we can get into tort reform and all of these other things, and the amount of lawsuits that are filed as a result of coastal living, if you will.
Yep.
And then the resultant high incidence of insurance costs. All of these things impact our oil and gas industry, all of our industry, frankly. So I'm telling you all of this because I just want to get your view. Is Louisiana becoming less attractive to business in your view from what you hear?
No, I would say not. And in fact, certain types of businesses that are natural gas based. I mean, I know you would know, given what you do, you would know better than I do the amount of investment that's being made in that state in the chemical industries because of the, amount of natural gas around. And the river certainly has to be a big part of the value add. I mean, that's a natural resource, right? That because the river, I mean, New Orleans itself or Louisiana itself is a pinch point, if you will. So, the secret there to me is making sure that the state gets, which might call adequately, gets a proportional share, its adequate share of the value of having that river, but you can't get too greedy either, because then, companies, there is a marketplace and companies go elsewhere. But so I think for certain types of business, Louisiana is a pretty natural place to go.
Well, Craig, I want to ask if you would mind if Ed could share your coordinates with me.
Sure.
I think your program is really good. I think it would be fun to have you make this exact presentation to a larger audience.
Sure. No problem.
And hopefully, Michael,
Okay. I have witnesses.
Michael, your words be gospel, maybe at some point in time in person. And I second those comments too, what Michael just said to you, Craig, and the having a December program, we need to get you back. Reminder that you are back in January 21st to that roundtable discussion back with Wells Fargo. And Michael, I will share his information with you, and I'd like maybe I'll let you two connect. There's some things happening in the state, Craig, that Michael knows better than anyone else what's happening here as far as opportunity and perhaps challenges. We have Christoph with Lafayette, and Lafayette certainly has its share of businesses too. And Christoph, thanks for joining us too this morning from your International Center. But this is recorded. It will be available on our website after this meeting. We're back on the 21st with Craig. In the meantime, we wish you all a great, happy holiday season. Mr. Moughler, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, terrific. Great to see all you guys. Great to meet you.
Great. Thank you, sir. Be safe.
Thanks.